Okay, I think we'll get started. Good evening, everybody. My name is Shauna Lechner-Rumpel, and I'm going to be your host. I am from the Mastocytosis Society of Canada. So pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you for joining us. I noticed there are still a few people sort of trickling in. So I'll get started with my introduction, and then I'll hand things over to our guest speaker tonight, Wendy Busse. So some of you may already be familiar with MSC if in the past you've reached out to us for information or support. But for those who haven't, the goal of our organization is really twofold. First, we're really here to raise awareness and education of patients, caregivers, and healthcare providers. And we do that in a number of ways. We participate in awareness days. Back in October of 2018, we had our very first Mast Cell, International Mast Cell Awareness Day. So we participated heavily in that. And then just last week, Rare Disease Day as well. So we put out a lot of messages and helpful information on social media. The other part of our goal, from an awareness perspective as well, we often attend physician conferences, most specifically in the allergy and immunology perspective. We attend physician conferences to try and raise the awareness and education of physicians in that specialty as well. From a support and guidance perspective, we have a very rich website with a lot of information. So if you haven't visited our website, it might be a good opportunity to check that out. Also, from a support perspective, we have a fairly lengthy list of physicians across Canada who've got education, awareness, and knowledge of mast cell disease and are in a position to diagnose and treat. So we get a lot of emails from patients looking for a healthcare provider in their area who might have the expertise in mast cell disease. MSC has had a really busy 2019 so far, even though we're only 2 months in. Earlier this year, we launched a blog. So this is going to be a weekly blog with lots of valuable information. Information from experts, research, food sensitivity. Wendy is kind enough to contribute to our blog. Patient stories, living with mast cell disease, etc. So if you haven't done so, head over to mastocytosis.ca and subscribe to our blog, and that will come to you on a weekly basis. Lots of really good information there. And of course, in addition to the blog, we're launching our very first webinar this evening, which is of course why you're here. So our goal with these webinars, we hope to host 4 of them in a year. We feel like it's incredibly valuable to bring a group of people together to learn about a particular topic. So tonight, we are very excited to have with us Wendy Busse. Wendy has been a longtime friend of MSC, and we're real glad to have her here today. Wendy is a registered dietitian specializing in food sensitivity for over 25 years. Her practice has evolved into helping food-sensitive clients make peace with food. Her interest goes beyond science and into the emotional aspects of coping with food and the fear of eating. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that, of course, from Wendy's presentation this evening. So before I hand over the virtual podium to Wendy, there's just a couple of things that I want to talk about specifically with regard to the webinar. This is our very first one, so please be patient with us if we have some minor technical glitches, but we think we're in pretty good shape. On your Zoom toolbar, so on your screen, you should have a toolbar, likely either at the top or the bottom. You will see a chat icon. So I believe I have it set so that you can only chat with me, the host. And I would like for you to do that if you're having issues maybe hearing Wendy or seeing the slides, etc. So just alert me if there's an issue. At the end of Wendy's presentation, there's going to be a Q&A, a question and answer period. So on the bottom of your toolbar, you're going to notice a Q&A tool. Please use that tool to send me your questions while Wendy's presenting even. As they strike you, go ahead and send them to me. I'm going to collect them. I'll categorize them. And then when Wendy has finished her presentation, I will sort of moderate that Q&A session, and I'll ask Wendy the questions, and hopefully we can get you the answers that you're looking for. Lastly, we are also going to be using a polling function just so we can learn a little more about you, the audience, and also to sort of keep you engaged and break up the presentation just a little bit. So watch for those. Answers are completely anonymous, so please feel free to share. And so with that, I think that's everything. I am going to now turn it over to Wendy for her expertise on managing food sensitivity, fears, and frustrations. Go ahead, Wendy.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shauna, for that introduction. And this is a topic that is, for many people with mast cell disease, a really important topic for them, particularly when you suffer from food sensitivities, particularly unpredictable food sensitivities. Fear and frustration can be very commonplace. And what often happens then is you get into a vicious cycle. So you may experience some physical symptoms that leads to fear and frustration. Then the stress of that can increase the physical symptoms, which then increases the fear and frustration, and around you go, as I say, a vicious circle. So learning to manage the fear and frustrations can go a long ways to helping improve your quality of life. It doesn't cure mast cell disease, it doesn't fix food sensitivities, but it just really helps with the coping with everything that you have to go through. Now, I'd like to start with a self-reflection to begin with, and we'll just take 1 minute, so 3 minutes total, 1 minute if you can think about each of these questions. The first is, how much time do you spend thinking about food and your symptoms? How does this impact your life? And what is your biggest frustration with food? So we'll take 3 minutes, and if you can just think on your own about those questions. So thank you for taking the time to do that self-reflection. When I'm working as a dietitian, I work with clients on this topic. And one of my, I would say, my umbrella goals, big goals for working with clients, is to help them where food isn't as big a part of their life. So often when I first meet with clients, food is it's a big part of their life. It's a really big source of stress. And often our goal is working towards where food becomes a part of life, but not the major part of life. And so I think that first question, how much time do you spend thinking about food and your symptoms, is a really important one. So now we're going to go on and we're going to start talking about the 8 strategies that are in the handout that Shauna emailed to you this morning. And I'm just going to read so we can do a quick overview of the strategies. The first is nurture an observant, responsive mindset. And I'll be coming back to talk about each one of these individual. Listen to your body and honor this insight. Ask yourself, is this symptom a food trigger? Letting go of finding your exact triggers or perfect diet. Make one change at a time. Reduce research and critical thinking. Incorporate more pleasure into your life. and meal plan, plan your meals and reduce what I'm going to eat. So we're going to do start in, as we go through these strategies, you may find that there's several areas and several things that you want to work on. And that's great. That's fantastic. But it also can be really overwhelming. And so what I would suggest is, and what happens often when I know myself, when I get really overwhelmed with too many things I'm trying to change, is I often freeze up and I don't take any action whatsoever. So I really encourage people to start small with just one or a few changes. And I really like this quote: "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." So just thinking about a few changes that you can make rather than trying to make dramatic, massive changes very quickly. So we'll begin with our first poll right now. And I do want to, please be patient with us. We've never tried this live before. And so it popped up, so that's good. So when my symptoms flare up, I usually, and you can read them, I did put for all of them, none of the above. And really my goal with these is just to get you involved with it. So if none of these really apply to you, that's great. Just click none of above. So we'll just wait, I guess, a second for it to come in. This is very exciting. Now, I can't see the results.
Okay, so you can see.
I can see the question, but not the results.
Interesting. Okay, so I think as soon as I end the poll and share the results, Wendy, then you'll be able to see. Okay. And I'm going to do that now because we've got 19 of 27 people voted. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Okay. And I'm going to share the results so that everybody can see. And so, can you see them now?
Yes, good. Okay, use my so excellent. Good. That's really good. It said 42% calm my body and thoughts and remind myself that the symptoms may be short-lived. That's excellent. A really good, so that's excellent. And using my rescue protocol. So great. So for a lot of you, you're probably doing fantastic in this one. We'll go through it. Oh, I have to forward my slide, sorry. The first one is nurturing an observant responsive mindset. So it sounds like a lot of you guys are there. So that's fantastic. Is what happens for some people is symptoms end up triggering really worrisome thoughts. And then often the stress triggers a very reactive mindset, where sometimes the decisions that people make sometimes in that reactive mindset in the long run aren't that helpful. So one example would be restricting diet even further. So very few of you had said that, and for those that did, that's really common. That's often people that I'm talking with is it's fear of the symptoms causing fear, and then making a reaction thinking, oh, it must be food, and then restricting the diet even further. And I've seen over time often clients will have their symptoms will get worse, so that they'll restrict their diet, and then they're going along, and then they have another symptom flare up, and then they restrict further and further and further, and then eventually getting down to a really limited diet. And so nurturing an observant responsive mindset, that could be like just even being aware of the thoughts, and then really thinking, how realistic is that thought, and then also investing time in some relaxation, some mindful techniques like breathing, etc. And for a lot of these, if you're, I have further information regarding this on my website. I'm doing sort of a very quick overview here. Okay, so if we could go on to the next one, and you know what, I don't know that we're going to have time for a poll on each one, so I'm going to skip. I'm going to go right to the next one now, to the next strategy, and then the next one will have a poll as well. So the next strategy is to listen to your body and honor this insight. And I'm sure that a lot you've seen, if you've been on the internet, you have seen many diet lists the low histamine diet, the low salicylate or salicylisate. People pronounce it many different ways. I'm not sure which one is right, but GAPS diet, this diet, that diet. So many food rules on the internet, so many diet restriction lists. And to be quite honest, you know, I've been working in this area for over 25 years, and no one ever fits neatly into a list where the list completely explains. Everybody is an exception. Everybody is unique. And so one recommendation I can really give is to use the list as a guideline and sort of as background information, but not as a decision-making tool for what you will and won't eat. And as much as possible, listening to your body and honoring the insight. And why I say honor the insight is sometimes things don't make sense, and that's okay. Like if, let's say, the information that we need to really understand food sensitivities is an iceberg, what's known at this time is probably just the tip of the iceberg. So if we could fast forward 30 years ago, maybe something would make sense. So for example, I might have a client say, well, green beans seem to work for me, but yellow beans don't, but they're both beans. Why? That doesn't make any sense. Well, maybe not according to what we know right now, it doesn't make sense, but maybe if we could uncover more of that iceberg, it would. But in the meantime, I think it's good for us to honor the insight, even if it doesn't make sense. So if you have objectively observed, so it's not based on fear or based on thoughts, but very objectively observed a certain pattern, that's what you've observed. Whether it actually, we can explain why or not, that's the whys aren't as important, it's the observation. All right, so we'll travel on to the next one. So the next is let go of finding your exact triggers or perfect diet. So do you want to, how about let's pull up the poll for that one.
Okay, I think you should all see the poll on your screens now. So if you can go ahead and vote. Oh, there I go. A few people coming in. Apparently I'm the only one that can see that, so I apologize. I will publish it here in just a few seconds.
Yeah, okay, so the great majority is the both, and that is, yeah, that I would say is certainly what I tend to see is with mast cell disease is, a lot of times people are like, you know, these foods bother me all of the time, but there's all these other foods that it is inconsistent. And I think sometimes that search, so those of you that know for sure the foods that bother you and it's very consistent, you're in the lucky group for sure, is for those of you that there is some inconsistency, and if you're looking and you're searching for this exact list of food triggers, then that in itself, that search can cause suffering, can make your life more difficult. Some food sensitivities can be inconsistent. One of the things to keep in mind is when your body reacts to a food, it's not reacting to the food itself, but it's reacting to a component of the food. So for example, if someone, let's say, has peanut anaphylaxis, their body is reacting to one of the proteins in peanut. And there's 9 different proteins that can cause allergies, but that person is reacting to specifically one protein. Histamine would be another component of food. Oxalates, salicylates, all of those would be components of food, right? And some of those components that people are most interested in mast cell disease are extremely variable. So histamine, as an example, is you can have the same food that looks the same and taste, you can't really tell any difference. Like say Swiss cheese is an example. You go to 4 stores, get different samples of Swiss cheese, and they're all Swiss cheese and they look the same, but one sample is very, very low, one sample is very, very high, and the rest are somewhere in between. So a lot of these food compounds are really variable, and that can lead to quite inconsistent. Is one thing, and I think this goes beyond just food, but triggers in general. Sometimes, you have a symptom and you don't know exactly why. And I can totally understand that's frustrating. And, but as much as possible, trying to do the best that you can to figure out, but a balance between also being able to let it go and say, well, I don't know exactly what caused this, can really go a long ways to help really reduce some of that frustration that is so common when you have a multi-trigger type syndrome. And the other thing to keep in mind too, to think about, is symptoms or triggers. As you know for sure, there's internal triggers and there's external triggers. So external being, things in the environment that you can see and you can control. So food being the big one, say heat, although that could be internal too, but say air temperature or pollens, breathing in. Again, you can't always control them, but anyways, external things. But then there's always internal triggers, right, as well. So, changes in the disease itself, perhaps an infection, that you don't even know you have, but our immune systems are always fighting infections. That's what our immune system does. So anytime our immune system is fighting an infection, it kind of ramps up. So there can be, so a lot of times what happens when somebody has their symptoms get worse, it's like, okay, well, what happened external to cause this? And there's nothing obvious. And so that's very, very frustrating. Obviously something did cause it, but it could have been an internal change that you have no way of measuring and controlling. I think we often look to food, we often look to food and want it to be food as the trigger, and sometimes it is food, but often want it to be food because if our symptoms or disease is triggered by food mainly, then we can control it, because food is the one thing you have complete control over, what you put in your mouth. However, sometimes this leads people on a search for food when it isn't always food. And that leads us into our next topic, which is ask yourself, is this symptom a food trigger? And I mean, so I'm basically, these two strategies are very, very interrelated. Again, often food can be a trigger, but in a lot of cases, people are blaming it on food. Like I'll have clients that'll come and say, okay, well, I had my symptoms, my symptoms got worse. What did I eat? Okay, well, it must have been the chicken. And I'll give this is a very dramatic example. Actually, this person didn't have mast cell disease, but I think it is a very dramatic example where when I met her, she was, that day, she really had to have an appointment that day. She was eating 2 foods and suffering with kind of a reflux type syndrome, and was still having symptoms, and really, was very, very scared that she was allergic to all, still having symptoms, and she had narrowed her diet so much. And it took, actually, it was our initial appointment plus a lot of email discussion back and forth. But and actually at this time, I was more focusing on the low histamine diet than I was anything else. So actually this was a huge learning experience for me myself, like not just for her, it was for me as well. And she eventually, like after us emailing back and forth, she said, well, is it food? She said, the fact that I'm only eating 2 different foods and I'm still having symptoms, maybe it's not food at all. And I said, well, that's, quite a reasonable possibility. And she actually went right back, like she emailed and said, okay, I'm starting to going right back on my regular diet. I'm like, whoa, yeah, you can't go that fast back onto a regular diet. But she did, and was her symptoms did get worse. Now, it didn't cure her symptoms. She still had the symptoms, but now she was enjoying food. She wasn't malnourished. She wasn't worried. So that's an extreme example, right? But, I see that example to a lesser extent in many, many clients. So it's something always to ask, is this symptom of food trigger? And I could probably talk for the entire hour about this, so I'm going to go on. But yeah, it's an important thing to always keep in mind. The other thing I wanted to say as well that can happen, we do see in mast cell disease, and there is no scientific evidence for this, but certainly, I mean, a lot of clients can identify with it in that sometimes when someone has mast cell disease that really affects their digestive system, and they seem to be, every time they eat, they're having symptoms. In that case, it's probably not food sensitivity, like it's not reacting to a component of food. It's simply the act of digestion, and it's just food presence in the digestive system. So again, there's no, I'm not saying this is what happens, because there's no evidence to support it. It's just a speculation. But, just how some people, if there's pressure on their skin, that can cause mast cell activation in the skin and inflammation. It only makes sense that eating as food goes in there, lots is happening and the muscles are churning and all sorts of stuff. Like, you think of our tube, like kind of like a big long, tube, like a garden hose, right? And those muscles are squeezing together. Well, that's going to cause some pressure and stuff like that. So sometimes, I've had a lot of people say that when my disease is not in control, I can't eat, like everything I eat bothers me. And when it is in control, either medically managed or, the disease changes or whatnot, I can eat everything. And so, that would be a plausible explanation. Now, if that person that everything that they're eating and they're searching desperately to find, well, is it this food or that food? It's just going to be a futile search around and around and around at that point. So anyways, asking yourself, is this symptom a food trigger is important. Okay, so we're doing well for time. How about let's have another poll for make one change at a time. Sorry, Shauna, it's probably crazy trying to keep up with all the different polls. So
No, not at all. It's super
okay.
easy. Okay, so I'm hoping that you guys can see the poll, make one change at a time. When trying potential new treatments, I usually don't try new treatments, make one change at a time, jump around to new treatments haphazardly, or none of the above. I will also take this moment just to remind everybody that if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tool in your taskbar. We've got a couple questions so far, so keep them coming.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm just going to give it another couple seconds here. You guys are really good at voting. We've had some pretty high percentages. Oh, you're going to like this one, Wendy, because I think it fits exactly what you're saying. So I'm just going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. There you go.
Okay, so good. Making one change at a time. That's fantastic. You guys, it's almost like I'm preaching to the choir, right? So that's so this might not apply to you, but nevertheless, I think that's fantastic. One change at a time is key. A lot of times I'm talking with people that are haphazardly trying different treatments. And so an example might be, getting a new supplement, trying that for a period of time, then jumping, and not really giving it enough time to see if it's helping or not, and then jumping to another one and jumping to another one. And so often what happens is people in that kind of a case, they've spent a lot of money, they're a lot of effort, and they really haven't got good answers. So making one change at a time, which many of you are doing, which is fantastic, is great. So even I love the idea of written action plans. I'm kind of a type A person, but of a written action plan where thinking about, okay, what changes are you going to make? Like, what order are you going to make them? So you're just making one at a time, and really thinking about too, how much time do I need to see, to be able to assess this new treatment, how much time, and then as much as possible trying to let go of judging it until the end of that time. So let's say it's a month on a new supplement, not thinking constantly, oh, is it helping? Is it helping? Is it helping? But leaving it to the end. And I'll give an example from my life where we were going through a therapy treatment with a family member. And it was a long journey. It was a year-long program. And by about 3/4 of the way through, I was just exhausted with it, because I would, I'd be like, one day I'd be like, it's helping, it's great, this is fantastic. And then there would be a downward turn. Oh, it's not helping. It is helping. It's not helping. And it was to the point where, we were almost having to quit. It was just too exhausting for me particularly. And so I made the decision to to continue the year, to finish it out, but to suspend my judgment and not think about it until the end. And that was the best decision that I ever made, because I wasn't riding that roller coaster anymore. So yeah, so a big part of it is, how long do I need to judge? And then suspending, not thinking about constantly, and just waiting until that time to make a decision. Has this helped? Has it been significant enough to help, or has it not? And then really making one change at a time. So say, for example, with the low histamine diet, I often have clients, they're like, yes, the low histamine diet has really helped. But then when I go back and say, okay, well, what changes did you make? Often clients have followed the low histamine diet and started antihistamine medication at the same time. So then it's like, well, what helped? Was it the medication? Was it the diet? And you don't want to follow, or was it both? It could have been both that helped. Very much. That's a likely thing. But you don't want to be following medication or following a diet unless it is really helping. So as much as possible, trying to do one change at a time. And you guys are already there, the majority, so that's fantastic. So, and I'm actually going through these a little bit faster than I was thinking. I seem to be firing through. So actually, we do have time for another poll.
Sorry. Okay. So reduce research and think critically, Wendy?
Yes, please.
Okay. Let's do it. There, you should see it. Got some great questions coming in, guys. Keep them coming.
So, and if there's lots of good questions, you think, Shauna, because I'm actually going through a little bit faster than I thought, maybe what we could do is extend. I'll still keep on going fast, but then sometimes the questions, that's where the rich discussion comes. So I'll end a little bit earlier, and then we can have an extended discussion period. How does that sound?
Yeah, let's do it. Sounds great. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and share the results for you.
Okay, good. So yeah, you guys, it sounds like you guys are, again, fantastic. So really encourage you to, do exactly what many of you are doing, is limiting to reputable websites and the amount of research. It's, it's one of those things that, when you're suffering with a disease that is mysterious, right? There's so little, again, that iceberg analogy, so little of it is really understood. There's so much speculation about it. If you had something like diabetes as an example, as healthcare professionals, we have very detailed clinical practice guidelines. Almost any question, you could ask, there would be a well-defined, well-researched answer for. When it comes to mast cell disease, of course, there just isn't, and that makes it so much more difficult. And so people often turn to the internet for research or to get information, and a lot of times it can help, but it can also cause a lot more difficulty, and particularly with food. There is something bad has been written about just about every food out there. Just as a cute little story, I walked into a pharmacy. I was doing a health clinic. This was years and years ago. And the pharmacist said, hey. And I said, you know, hey, back, you know, like I thought he was saying hi. No, he wasn't. He said, no, I'm not saying hi. He said, I'm saying hey, Hay. He said, that's all we can eat these days is hay. Everything else is bad for us. And, you know, it was funny. It was a joke. He was a guy who was always joking all the time. But there was a lot of truth in what he had said, right? Is you could not find a food that somebody isn't saying something bad about. And so I know even myself, sometimes when I go and I'll go on to just kind of flip around on websites to kind of see what the word is out on the street and that kind of thing these days. And it'll make me feel suspicious about eating. I'll kind of look at my lunch, go, I'm not sure if that, you know, and then I have to sort of, you know, work my mindset around that. But research is a balance between finding information, but being very mindful and aware of when that research is going overboard. Okay. All right. So our next one is incorporating more pleasure into your life. So if you suffer with food sensitivities and you are a foodie, a lot of your life has been taken away. Like, you know, you know, food is one of our greatest pleasures. And a lot of our times, our social lives, our family lives revolve around food. And when a lot of that has been taken from you, it can have a really devastating effect on your life. Some people, food has never been a big part of their life. Like I've had a client recently that she had a very busy profession, and she's like, I eat to get through the day. That's all. I don't really care what I eat. Well, for her, food sensitivity actually was really easy. Like she wanted to expand her diet, and she said, look, I just need a couple proteins, a couple of this. Just need it to be easy. That's all. I don't care what I eat. It was really easy for her. But when you're a foodie, it's hard. Now, you know, certainly, like say my work is I help people expand their diet, and that can be a long journey. It's also good to think about incorporating other sources of pleasure. So for me, now I have to say I don't have food sensitivity, so I'm very fortunate in that way. So, but also I have a bottle here. This is essential oils. I love essential oils, and I enjoy breathing them in. So I'll breathe them in as I'm talking here. I love them that much. But to me, it's like a you know, it's just a little moment of sensory pleasure. And that's often what is missed from food. So really thinking about if you're really grieving, having lost that pleasure in your life from food, you know, where else? And, you know, one client put it really well. She said, you know, food used to be this big part of my life. I used to always meet my friends for coffee. And she said, now I meet my friends for a walk instead. And I know for many of you, you know, that might be difficult. Like so much gets taken away from you. But, you know, she said, like, food used to be the center of my life, and now it's a part of my life, not a center. And so that was a really very positive approach that client took. So just thinking about, you know, if there are things that you can do to bring pleasure into your life if you've lost the pleasure from food. And finally, meal planning to reduce what am I going to eat. Now this is huge, and this goes way beyond just food sensitivity, right? Like I also work very part-time for my local health region, and I'm doing general counseling. This is the biggest topic that most people face, the biggest difficulty that most people face, right? Like even me as a dietitian, a lot of times I'm like, what are we going to eat, right? Like I you know, meal plan, and then I forget to do it, and then I meal plan. And you know, when I'm meal planning and I'm like, okay, yeah, tonight we're going to have this, or tomorrow night we're going to have this, it just makes it so much easier, right? So I have seen huge transformation in people just simply meal planning. And because you think of how much time do you spend thinking, what am I going to eat? And then, you know, going to the grocery store and, you know, standing looking at the fridge, and that can be really frustrating. And you can spend more time I know myself, I can spend more time thinking about what am I going to make or whatnot than actually doing it. And then if you throw food sensitivities in there, it makes it so much harder, because you don't just have some of the options of saying, oh, okay, we'll just, grab this or grab that, right? You have to be very careful. So I've seen, for clients where, and also I'm going to backtrack here for a second, is also along with planning meals, I found a lot of clients find huge benefit in freezing meals, so that they have kind of a stock of ready to go meals in their freezer, especially for those clients that are trying to have no leftovers and they're trying to eat their food fresh, and they're cooking. Freezing large amounts, making large amounts and freezing them and having ready to go meals in their freezer. For some clients, I've seen it dramatically improve the quality of their life. Then they don't have to, they know, they have that confidence knowing, yeah, I've got some meals in my freezer, and, it's 5 o'clock, and, I had one client that, couldn't eat with their family, and now could just say, okay, 5 o'clock, all right, I'm going to pull this out, I'm going to heat this up, way to go. So meal planning can really make a significant improvement in quality of life. So just to summarize, and we'll take all of our extra time then, and we'll just go through the questions, is that we've talked about 8 different strategies. As you find, and I talked about, if there was something that's like, oh yeah, that's a change I'd like to make. And if all of a sudden clients think there's many changes to make, it become overwhelming. But really, as you'll see, all of these strategies are very much interrelated. So progress in one leads to progress in all, and to often all the strategies. So an example would be, let's say that you were, say, doing like a lot of internet research. And let's say that you think, okay, that's the one little thing I'm going to work on is, reducing my internet research. So doing that probably will reduce haphazard treatment changes, which then would leave more time for incorporating more pleasure. So you can see how one change kind of snowballs to all of the changes. And the other way I like to see it, almost like, all of those areas in life that we struggle with, like think of a rope with a bunch of knots, and each of those knots is an area of difficulty. And I have knots too. It's not just not just you have knots. We all have this rope with knots, right? And I like to think of, as we loosen and we kind of work and massage and loosen up one of those knots, is all of the knots kind of loosen up as well. So progress really can be, I just really want to emphasize that, yeah, one little change can snowball into a lot of changes. And even if it doesn't, like, let's say you just make one little change and you keep up that one little change for a long time. Like, let's say like that last thing we talked about, meal planning. So for example, so let's say that you make that change to start meal planning, freezing some meals, kind of getting organized around food. So let's say that saves you 2 hours a week in the kitchen. So that's really not that much, 2 hours. But so in a month, that would be 8 hours. In a year, 96, if I'm doing my math right, I'm not sure, but 96 hours. Well, that's a lot. Like that, if you think of a 40-hour work week, that is more than that's like having 2 weeks of holidays, right? More than 2.5 weeks of holidays. So you can see how just even a little change that you continue on with over the weeks and months can really significantly improve the quality of your life. And progress often, it's often, I find even in my own life with making progress on different things, it's sort of in the day-to-day, it almost seems like there's no progress, but it's when you look back and you're like, okay, I have made progress. So an example might be, let's say if when you experience symptoms, that often leads to really fearful thoughts, like say fearful thoughts about food, like, say an example, you have some symptoms. Okay, well, what food was it? What should I take out of my diet? Well, maybe I should do this. Maybe I should do that. I think it's the carrots. I'm going to take carrots out. So that's an example, right? So just, you know, this, and then let's say through nurturing, you know, to which many of you are already doing, is rather than thinking about the symptoms and thinking about it, you know, pulling out your tools like mindful breathing to help calm the mind, calm the body. So it might be, again, so the point that I'm trying to make is, you know, you might think, oh yeah, I'm not making that much progress, but then you think, you know what, 6 months ago, if I had experienced this symptom I'm experiencing right now, I would have been really worried about it. And now I'm still worried a bit, but, you know, I'm really able to pull out my mindful breathing tools and calm my body. So yeah, it's something, progress, yeah, it doesn't have to be dramatic and all at once, just step by step by step is really great progress. And I just wanted to end again, I love this picture so much. The journey of 1,000 miles really begins with a single step. So I got through that a lot quicker. I was worried that it was going to take too much time. And so I guess I cut out a lot of what I did want to say, but anyways, let's open it up for questions and discussion.
Okay, so the first question here, Wendy, is focused on sort of food in a social setting, I guess, if you will. So kind of a couple of questions here, so just bear with me. Our culture is very focused on eating, and sometimes it's very difficult to join in group activities when it's centered around food. And then sort of related to that is, how do I help my friends and family accept my food intolerances and not feel fearful about sharing food with me? So it's kind of that food in a social setting where you're not at home and you have a little less control.
Okay, sounds good. I'm actually going to, because I have a blog article on this very thing. So I'm going to end my slideshow. I'm going to try to end my slideshow. Oh, there we go. And I'm going to pull up my website. So this is my website. Can everybody see the website now?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, okay. I think you should be able to, Wendy.
Okay. So I have like public resources. I have two sections. So one is manage food sensitivity, fears, and frustrations. And this article here, holiday eating with food sensitivity, talks about just that. So I would jump into there. So come back. So the questions was how to have them accept without. If I'm understanding correctly, is it sounds, because there can be two issues, right? It can be family members that are inconsiderate, they don't accept, so they keep feeding you the food anyways. But it sounds like in this case, it's more of a family member who's very fearful of it. I would say in that case, probably just pre-planning like that. And again, so this is kind of going beyond just that question, so I apologize, but as much as possible, yeah, is talking with people beforehand, which I'm sure you are already doing, but you know, looking at the menu, yeah, going through it with them, often bringing your own food. Like one of the, like, again, this isn't directly answering your question, but one of the, you know, say for example, like if you're going to a, you know, trying to encourage, you know, it's easier, like a potluck meal is probably your easiest bet versus everybody is sitting around the table and, you know, passing dishes around and you're passing every dish, or, you know, and, you know, passing every dish and not taking anything. That can be so very, very uncomfortable. Potluck dinner often much easier. So, and then you can bring a dish or two that you know you can have, and then you can, you know, put them down. If you do suffer, like let's say you suffer anaphylactic type allergies and you truly need to avoid cross-contamination of the food, then you can take your, you know, take yours, like uncover your dish, take what your portion that you need to fill up, and then not go back because of course the contamination. Now that's if you need to avoid cross-contamination. If you don't, then no worries. So yeah, sometimes encouraging the potluck meals can just make it can be easier. And how to, I guess maybe that's a question then, how to explain them to them. And that is a difficulty too, because it's something, it's something that people don't really understand. And did we ever, because Shauna, we were talking about doing something, there is something on the website about that, right? How to explain it to family and friends, right?
Yeah, but not necessarily related to food. So
Okay.
we do have on our website a bit of a write-up on how to describe mast cell disease in general, right? Because it can be very complicated. But it might not be a bad idea. Maybe I'll make a note of that to have something on our website that's a very succinct way of describing, why you might not be interested in eating food in public that doesn't, raise more questions, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I'm sorry, it's not, but it's hard to know what angle exactly you're coming from. But yeah, so hopefully that helps. That's a little bit. But this article here on my blog, and these are free of, like, I have public resources and then my private client resources. So you just click on them, and yeah, you've got the whole article. And you can also download them too. Like if you're not, like, you'd like to take time off the internet, you can click this and download it. And then there's the article as a PDF, and then you can just print it, and yeah. You don't have to spend too much time on the internet.
Great. While you're on your blog, Wendy, I'm going to ask you this question because I know you also have an article on this. Just give me one moment. Will you be sharing a list of low histamine foods, or at least high histamine foods to stay away from? Now, I know in the past MSC had published a low histamine diet, and we've since taken it off and replaced it with more guidelines and things to consider as opposed to a hard and fast diet. So do you want to share with us your thoughts on a low histamine diet in particular?
I will. And I also want to show you another section. So I have another section here. So HIT and MCAT information. And so this has all the information on, like, low histamine diet, etc. Don't read it right now because I am actually going to be updating it by the end of March. And maybe what I could do, Shauna, is I'll send you an email when I'm done, and then you could email everybody.
Sure, great.
So in general, the low histamine diet, there is no hard and fast rules, and that's why you find so much variation, right? And that's why we took our list off, because we didn't need yet another list on the internet that disagreed with all the other lists, right? I do have my practical guide to the low histamine diet. So it's in it, but it's not eat these foods. It's not bad foods, good foods. It's these foods tend to bother people more, and these foods tend to bother people less. But really encouraging everybody as an individual. It's the diet, why? So the question then, okay, well, why is there not an exact list? Like, if you think of something like gluten, I don't know how many studies there have been on gluten, and like to measure gluten in food. If there's 10,000, it wouldn't surprise me. So, hundreds of studies to develop a technique to measure to measure gluten. And then hundreds and hundreds and thousands of more studies then to measure gluten in food. So there's lots, so if we look at gluten, there's lots of research, and gluten is fairly stable in food, right? So, 2 pieces of bread that have the same kind of wheat or whatever, they're going to have just about the exact same amount of gluten. So I could give you a gluten-free diet and say, yeah, I'm really 100% confident that this is a gluten-free diet. I wouldn't say 100%, nothing's 100%, but I'm quite confident, right? And the problem with the low histamine diet is there's very little research. And so there was some research in like the 70s and 80s. There was different techniques used to measure histamine, kind of gave different results. To be honest, it's not just histamine, it's all the diamines. I won't go through the details. It's all in the blog thing there, but all the diamines. So it's not just the amount of histamine in food. It's everything. It's several compounds that are probably a concern. And those compounds are highly variable. So it's not to say, you can't say, okay, Swiss cheese, we talked about that as an example. That could be a food that is very susceptible to histamine formation. Doesn't mean it has histamine, right? So then you get all these variations in the food. Spinach, for example. So there was a study that looked at spinach that, some samples of spinach had histamine, but that histamine changed as it sat. It went up, and then actually it went down, and it, so it's extremely variable. So it's not, I would say, this is why, like, I don't like the word, I put practical guide. Like, even, I really think that the low histamine diet is not a diet as much as it is a concept, and it's a guideline. So yeah. So, of course, the foods that are high, I'm sure that you're all aware of, fermented foods are more likely because so histamine forms when bacteria grows in food. And I'm hearing myself double. Is anybody else hearing that? Like, are you hearing me, Shauna, say things back?
Just right now, Wendy, like it just started in the last 10 seconds. So keep talking and let's see if it clears itself up.
Okay. So testing. I'm going to keep talking anyway. So, with, so it grows as bacteria grow in food, histamine and related compounds can grow. So that's why like leftovers are suspect. Histamine can definitely grow in leftover foods, and fermented foods because bacteria grow. Yet not all bacteria or yeast or whatnot produce the enzyme that is responsible for the formation of histamine. So it's not a simple thing. So those are the foods like leftovers. Histamine tend to be higher. Tomatoes tend to be something that bother people. Actually, whether it's high in histamine or not, it's hard to say. It could be something else. Vinegar tends to bother people, although there was a study looking in like plain vinegar had no histamine in it in this, but it was only one sample they tested, so who knows. But vinegar tends to bother people, even if, so it doesn't sound like it's a histamine, it might be something else. Yeah, I think using this as a guideline, but not an exact rule. And on my web, this information in here, I talk about maybe even taking it in stages, right? Because often people are restricting all these foods. They're maybe doing, they're avoiding leftovers, avoiding alcohol. Alcohol seems to be a big trigger, a really big trigger. Again, there could be many reasons why. It's not just histamine, and it's lots of different things. So, maybe even doing it in stages, like maybe first of all, removing alcohol if you haven't done that already, seeing how does that go. Maybe trying doing leftovers, eating everything you're eating, but just no leftovers, so freezing your meals. Does that make a difference? And then trying restricting all the food, right? So it's not like it's like you're kind of piecemealing it, and you're just kind of being more systematic and really seeing what part of this diet, if it does make a difference for you.
It's kind of back to that, make one change at a time, right?
Yeah,
as opposed to just going full bore on a low histamine diet. Try, a few things at a time.
Yeah.
And the article that you have there, Wendy, is excellent in it, and it really describes that quite nicely.
And I just wanted to emphasize one more thing too. Like, so much of it is speculation. So example, you'll find on the list, a list of foods that release histamine. That's complete speculation. Like, I did my master's thesis on this topic I started in 93. And so of course, when you're doing that, I mean, you have to go back and find the original research. And so I searched and searched and searched and searched. There was no original research that foods could release histamine. It was somebody presented the idea, and it sounded good, and it caught on, and it becomes kind of like a rumor. So just like maybe, there's a rumor that Bob likes pink shirts, and then it gets spread around, and then Joe says to Mary, well, how do we know Bob likes pink shirts? Well, Frank said. Oh, well, and that's exactly what's happened, right? Like, you will see in research studies, like in a research study, when you make a comment like the histamine releasing foods, and then you have a citation, like a little number, that number should then, you go to the back of the research article, and it should give you, tell you the research that supports that. All is happening is they're putting somebody else that mentioned it, right? Like, this other research group said it, and they said it, and they said it, but there's no evidence that any foods actually can release histamine in the body. And what happened then is, so back in it was, the idea that foods could release histamine, and then you had, a few foods listed, and then along comes the internet, and people just keep adding to that list, adding. And, I think rather than, saying foods that release histamine, more accurate term would be foods that tend to bother people more than other foods, right? Again, it's still valuable. I'm not saying, oh, it's just a bunch of hot poppycock. I'm not saying that, because, you know, it's also good to, you know, have that kind of background. Okay, you know, these foods tend to bother other people, but really, do they bother me? And just, I know I talk too much, and I apologize. So, but this is a really good example. And I was at a presentation and it was to a group of people like mast cell disease, and I had spoken through lunch, and so I was really hungry, and I was standing around chatting with some people, and I said, oh, I'm hungry. I said, I'm going to go to the cafeteria, and somebody pulled out a banana out of her bag and said, do you want my banana? And there was probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 people, and 3 people gasped and said, we can't eat bananas. And she said, but I can eat bananas. And I thought that was, I would have loved to record that, right? Because it was a great example how, you know, some people were like, you know, it's on a list, we can't eat it. And she's like, well, but I'm going to base it on me, which is, you know, what we need to do. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Exactly.
And Shauna, you might have to cut me off at a certain point, because I tend to,
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. We've got 15 more minutes, and so I'm just going to keep up with some questions here. So this is again sort of a fairly severely restricted diet, but do you have any advice on how I can maintain a balanced diet when I have to eat gluten-free, egg-free, low histamine, and low salicylate?
Okay.
You know, any supplement recommendations or sort of any advice there?
Okay. Well, and you know, like a multivitamin mineral supplement is a good idea for everybody. Like I take one myself, even though I eat a full varied diet, it's just a good idea for everybody. So that would, you know, basically the other thing to think about too is, okay, just because your diet is restricted doesn't mean, like, ideally, you know, we always talk as dietitians, we talk about variety, and yeah, and that is a principle that is ideal, and you know, we want to work towards if we can't. However, if you can't, it doesn't mean you have a bad diet. If you think back to a few generations ago, so I live in the prairies in Alberta, and so my great grandparents, they would have eaten beef. They were farmers. Beef, like their diet might have consisted of 15, 20 different foods, right? Simply because that's all they had, and they ate the same thing over and over and over, day in, day out. Yet, I remember grandma lived at 98 years old. Yet they, in a lot of ways, were a healthier generation, much healthier generation. And it's not the food. I'm not saying it. I mean, they were exercising. They had, you know, blah. There's a 1,000 reasons, right? But I guess what I'm saying is, you know, many generations were brought up on very restricted diets and were strong generations. So just because your diet is fairly limited doesn't mean it's malnourishing. And often I'll have clients, you know, client will say, oh, you know, I'm restricted to 5 different vegetables and that's it, or 4 different vegetables and that's it. And, you know, I'll often say, well, that's 4 more than most people eat, right? Even people that can eat anything, they're not making great choices a lot of times. They're eating processed fast foods and whatnot. So just to keep that in mind, just because it's restricted doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad diet. And more, you know, it's good, you know, like, yeah, even, you know, and this, okay, I'm going to say another thing too, is that, you know, expanding, that's often what I work with people doing is trying to help them to expand their diet. But expanding doesn't just have to be eating new foods. Like when we think about variety in terms of pleasure, expanding doesn't have to be eating new foods. It can be taking those foods and preparing them in a creative way. So actually just right before our meeting today, I'd made these like a couple weeks ago. I'd made these muffins, and I don't know what I did. I screwed up somehow with them. Anyways, they're all mushy in the middle and nobody would eat them. And so I threw them in the freezer, and I just took them out yesterday. I chopped them all up and I threw them on my dehydrator because I said they were mushy and stuff, right? And really good. Like they're really like crunchy. And that, you know, I thought, wow, that's another thing I need to put on my list, because, you know, so you could have a muffin, right? And then you dehydrate that muffin and it's like a totally different food. Like it even tastes like, it tastes the same, but because the texture is different, it sort of tastes different too. Or I was out for supper with my family and there was these long, skinny vegetables. And I'm like, oh, what is this? I've never had this vegetable. It's so very interesting. And the waitress said, it's celery. And I'm like, ooh, okay. But the thing was that they'd spiralized it, right? So it looked different and it tasted completely different to me. So sometimes creativity can also be just taking that limited food and doing something different with it to make it a lot more exciting and interesting. So hopefully that helps.
Here's a question, Wendy, about how would you recommend reintroducing foods that have been out of your diet for a long time? So, and we've had a few questions about reintroduction. So what are your thoughts on that?
So and that's a lot of sort of what I do kind of as my work. There's no one way, is a couple tips. Slow is good. And honestly, if I worked with 10 people or 100 people, we would probably come up with, well, not 100 different protocols, but we'll say, okay, 10 people, we would have 10 different protocols, because for everybody, it's a little bit different. But a couple of the key kind of overriding things. For most people, just kind of a gradual reintroduction. Anybody who hasn't eaten a food in a long time, like, that client I said that went from like this 2 foods to like overnight to a really full diet, she actually was fine, but I was really surprised that she was. For most people, they will suffer digestive symptoms, like so just sort of very gradually introducing. For a lot of people, especially for those, like if for some people it really seems that they'll eat a new food day 1, it's fine. Day 2, it's okay. Day 3, it starts to be not so okay. Day 4, no, they're really feeling it. Day 5, no, this isn't working, right? I don't know why. There's no explanation as to why, but that really does seem to be something that a lot of people experience. In that case, a lot of times with people will set up like almost like a rotation introduction where you maybe have a little bit of the new food on day 1. And then the next time day 1 comes around, you eat a little bit more of that food, and you have a different one, usually day 2, 3, 4. And then the next time it comes out a little bit more, right? So you're not like eating that food every day. That seems to work. Like for a lot of people, that seems to be quite effective. For someone who is now the typical, like if you were to go and ask like just a dietitian, any dietitian, or you ask a doctor, okay, food challenges, what is a food challenge? They will say, okay, and it might be, let's say it's going to be a 3-day food challenge. You're going to eat a little bit on day 1 and a little bit on day 1, and then you're going to eat, maybe 3 times on day 1, and then you're going to eat more and more and more on day 2 and more and more on day 3. And if by the end of day 3 you haven't had any symptoms, then we say that you can eat this food. That works very well. That works very well if you have no other triggers, right? Like if food is your absolutely only trigger and you can get through those 3 days, no symptoms, then that works. But let's say you have lots of different things. So let's say on the end of day 1, you walk into a store and you're talking to a person and they have an incredible amount of perfume, and that happens to be a trigger for you. Well, you're going to have symptoms, and then you're like, okay, well, was the symptom food, or was the symptom the perfume? Which was it? And then it becomes really hard to tell. So that food challenge for some people can work really well, but for a lot of, like if you have a lot of other triggers, it's just not going to work well. And then you're better off to do it like just kind of gradually, introducing it more on a rotation. And then what I often say, because like with people again, is if if you're like, oh, I think that bothered me, but you're not really sure. Like if it's like that bothered me, there's no question about it, then you end that introducing that food. But if it's like, well, I think sort of maybe, then there's a way that we have to record it. And then and then if it keeps bothering you, then you don't eat it. But if it's just sort of like, well, I think maybe, then it's good to keep going with it, because especially again, if you have a lot of symptoms by a lot of triggers, you could think maybe every single food and never get anywhere. The other thing is I would just say is a plan. a lot of times people try to reintroduce foods kind of haphazardly, like, oh, there's some blueberry, I'll try that. How did that go? Oh, this, and it's just kind of haphazard reintroductions. And that usually doesn't go well. Now, that's why I see, like, right, if I can't say that doesn't go well, because the people that I see, it hasn't gone well for them, but that's why they've come to me, right? There could be a whole bunch more people that it did go well, and they don't need me, right? So, but again, I'm type A. I really believe in, having, a plan. Not to say that you have to follow the plan exactly, but at least having a written plan to follow. So it's not an exact answer, but I hope those little bits of tips help.
Yeah, that's perfect. So I think probably the last question here, Wendy, which I think is probably a quick one. Currently, are there any research studies to better understand how food acts as a trigger in mast cell disease? I haven't heard of any. Have you?
Mm-mm.
Wow, it should be.
I don't even know if it's being researched. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
I don't even know if it's being researched. I don't even know any teams looking at it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sure would be nice for someone to take that on, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it definitely would. There's little bits and pieces of research with histamine, like, and actually it's interesting. Probably the last year, 4 studies, and they're not really well done studies, unfortunately. Most of them don't have any, they don't have a placebo group, which is really important. But anyways, there are some groups studying. There's probably more like studies that have come out in the last year when it comes to histamine. So whether that's mast cell disease, I mean, that's a whole nother, we could do a whole webinar on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at least on that, there's probably more studies published in the last year than probably in the last 20 years. So, and again, they're not really well done studies, but nevertheless, it's still something, right? So, we might over time get more concrete information, low histamine, but in terms of mast cell disease, I don't even think anybody's necessarily looking at that.
Yeah, there's so many things to conquer when it comes to research of mast cell disease.
No.
So, okay, I realize that we didn't get to all of the questions. What I think I'll do is, Wendy, if it's okay with you, let's work together over the next few days. Any questions that didn't get answered, we'll provide a written response for, and I'll post it on our mastocytosis.ca website along with the recording, so that everything is sort of there nicely together. And then potentially we can maybe incorporate a few of those answers into the nutrition side of our website as well, if there are some pieces missing. So I just wanted to take this opportunity, Wendy, to thank you very much for sharing with us your 8 tips for overcoming food fears. I think that we can all take something away from the presentation tonight. And I also did want to just give a shout out to your blog. I've used it as a resource many times, both personally and from an MSc perspective. And there's some really great information there. So I encourage you all to check out Wendy's blog. She's been kind enough to allow us to share her information on our own blog. So some really valuable stuff. So thank you, Wendy.
Yeah, thank you. This has been interesting. It's been a good experience. I'm surprised how well those polls worked. That was really nice.
Yeah, that was pretty neat, hey? So there is one thing before we conclude. I did want to mention just one last thing, and this is really for the audience's understanding, and then also I'm going to ask a favor. So on May 4th and 5th, there is a very first American Initiative in Mast Cell Disease conference. So this conference is the first of its kind. It is bringing together experts, physicians, researchers from all over the world to try and establish Mast Cell Center of Excellence in Canada, US, Mexico, South and Central America. So really sort of a North American, South American kind of a Mast Cell Centers of Excellence. That we have some in Europe. The European countries have really jumped on board, and now we really want to try and establish these in North and South America. The creation of these centers is key. We need to establish some type of expertise in Canada, in the States, and some of the southern countries as well. And so it will certainly help to improve diagnostics. It will help to improve research. It will help to improve treatment options and overall just the general well-being and support of mast cell patients. So you know, I mention that because I think it's important that you know that there are groups of experts and people who are advocating for these types of things, and it will be phenomenal once they are set up, but it's going to take some work to get there. We believe that it's important that MSC make the journey to the conferences. We'd like to send 2 delegates. I think that it's important that Canadian mast cell patients are well represented there. And also I think that MSC has a role to play in working with and rallying Canadian physicians to really support this initiative as well, because we can't do it without them. So again, I mentioned that from an information perspective. And if any of you are feeling particularly benevolent on this Wednesday evening and would like to donate to MSC to help us get to that conference, we would truly appreciate it. I think that your donation would go a long way in helping us get there and allowing us to carry on our advocacy for mast cell patients. So please, if you can, would really appreciate it. So lastly, I'd like to thank everyone for spending the evening with us. The fact that our very first webinar had over 100 registrants is proof that we need this type of information. So again, a very special thank you to Wendy for her presentation tonight. When the meeting ends, you're going to be presented with a very short survey about tonight's webinar. We'd really like to hear some feedback from you, not only on how tonight's webinar went, but maybe some additional topics that you'd like to hear about in the future. So thank you in advance for 3 things: subscribing to our blog if you haven't already, giving a donation if you're able, and completing the webinar after completing the survey after the webinar is over. So thank you all very much. We wish you all a very stable and reaction-free evening, and good night. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.